Hey, welcome back. Today we're learning about 1941, an incredibly fascinating time in history. This is the podcast where we don't just remember the past, we pull up a chair and let it tell us some stories. This is old news. The year was the turning point when a distant war became a truly global conflict, finally pulling the United States into the fray. The UK remained isolated against Hitler's near absolute dominance over Western Europe after the Battle of Britain. Recognizing Britain's desperate need for aid, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act in March. This act was a pivotal moment of de facto U.S. entry into the war, allowing the president to lend military equipment and supplies to any nation whose defense was deemed vital to U.S. security, notably Great Britain and later in the year, the Soviet Union. Roosevelt famously compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. An interesting example of this U.S. support was the PT, or Patrol Torpedo Boat. While the Axis forces focused on massive steel-armored battleships, the U.S. pivoted toward an agile, decentralized defense by utilizing civilian manufacturing. We didn't build fortresses, we built mosquitoes. This began back in 1939 with the Plywood Derby, a race to find a boat that could outrun anything it could not outgun. Fisher Boat Works in Detroit, Michigan emerged as a winner, proving that the Midwest's master woodworkers could build a weapon as deadly as any steel destroyer. The soul of these vessels was pure Detroit. At the Packard Motor Car Company, luxury assembly lines were ripped out and replaced with a thundering production of 1,500 horsepower V12 marine engines, 3 per PT boat. By using double-planked South American mahogany instead of critical steel, the arsenal of democracy could flood the oceans with high-speed hunters without slowing down the production of our heavy cruisers. Performance-wise, these plywood wonders were a nightmare for traditional navies, weighing only 50 tons compared to the 2,000 tons of a standard steel destroyer. They could plane atop the water at blistering speeds of over 40 knots. And with a shallow draft of only 5 feet, they could skip over the reefs and maneuver through coastal shallows that would ground a steel ship. Under Lend-Lease, these boats became the perfect export to keep allies like Great Britain and the Soviet Union in the fight. This industrial miracle set the stage for military successes in the years to come. It provided the PT-41 that would spirit General Douglas MacArthur away from the Japanese blockade in 1942. It paved the way for the pitch-black night battles of Guadalcanal and the survival story of a young John F. Kennedy aboard the PT-109 in 1943. Even on D-Day in 44, these wooden boats were there, screening the massive invasion fleet and performing daring air-sea rescues. The U.S. proved that you don't need the biggest ship to win a fight. You just need the fastest. Back to 41, where the war dramatically escalated on June 22nd with the launch of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the largest military operation in history, immediately opening the immense Eastern Front. Hitler committed nearly 4 million Axis soldiers to the invasion, violating the non-aggression pact he had signed with Stalin in 1939. Though the invasion initially gained vast territory and inflicted horrific damage on the Red Army, the German advance stalled just short of Moscow due to the brutal Russian winter and fierce Soviet resistance. The operation failed in its primary goal of quickly knocking the Soviet Union out of the war, drawing Germany into a prolonged two-front conflict. While the world's attention was fixed on the frozen front lines outside Moscow, more clinical and quiet horror was being perfected in occupied Poland. By 1941, the camp at Auschwitz, originally opened in 1940 to hold Polish political prisoners, was undergoing a sinister transformation. It was no longer just a place to contain the enemies. It was becoming a laboratory for mass murder. In the cramped basement of Block 11, the SS conducted a gruesome experiment. They took 600 Soviet prisoners of war and 250 Poles and forced them into a sealed room. For the first time, they used Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide previously used for delousing barracks. The speed and efficiency of the gas provided the Nazi leadership with the proof of concept they had been looking for. This wasn't a battlefield execution, it was a chemical process. This experimental success in 1941 changed the trajectory of the war's darkest chapter. Construction immediately began on Birkenau, aka Auschwitz II, a massive expansion designed with the sole purpose of scaling up this chemical processing of humans. As the year drew to a close, the Nazi state was no longer merely shooting its victims in the forest to the east. It was building the infrastructure for a death factory. The experiment at Block 11 proved the regime could murder thousands of people with a turn of a valve, setting the stage for their systematic slaughter in the coming years. In August, as the U.S. began supplying the Allies, Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly off the coast of Newfoundland to sign the Atlantic Charter. This document was a joint declaration that outlined their shared vision for the post-war world, including principles of self-determination, free trade, and international cooperation. Though not yet a formal treaty, it served as a moral and political blueprint for the Allied cause and would later influence the creation of the United Nations. Meanwhile, another war was being fought in the quiet, smoke-filled rooms of London. Just days after the public release of the Atlantic Charter, George Orwell joined the BBC to produce broadcasts for the Eastern Service. His job was to bolster support for the Allied cause in India, but Orwell was a man who lived and breathed for the truth, and he quickly found himself suffocating under the weight of government censorship. In his diary, he wrote, "All propaganda is lies, even when it is telling the truth." And another entry, "The very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world. Lies will pass into history." Chilling realizations that still resonate in our age of fake news. Orwell was seeing firsthand how the official narrative version of reality was constructed. He realized that by omitting certain facts or spinning the narrative, a government could use partial truth to tell a lie. His book Animal Farm, published in 1945, was an allegory as a critique of the Stalinist betrayal of the Russian Revolution. But its lessons applied to any regime that claimed to be for the people, while seizing absolute power, quoting, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." This period of his life was also the catalyst for his most famous work, 1984, which was published in 1949. The drab, bureaucratic corridors of the BBC would eventually be reimagined as the terrifying Ministry of Truth in this novel. The real world was becoming a global chess match. But as Orwell warned us, the most dangerous part of that match wasn't just the movement of armies. It was the battle for the human mind. One of the quotes, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." It sums up the Nazi and Soviet efforts to rewrite history books. And it serves as a stark reminder that in times of crisis, the first casualty of war is often the objective truth. Orwell's fears of a thought police weren't just literary premonition. They were a mirror of the legal skirmishes happening on American soil that very year. A quiet war was being waged against the Fourth Amendment, the Constitution's shield that protects your persons, houses, papers, and effects from unreasonable searches and seizures. It was designed to keep the government's hands out of your private life without probable cause and a judge's warrant. But in 1941, that shield was under fire. Attorney General Robert Jackson and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover pushed for the legalized use of wiretapping, arguing that in an era of total war, the government's ears needed to be inside the homes and factories of those suspected of subversive thoughts. They argued that the invisible wall of privacy had to be dismantled to catch the fifth column before they would strike. While Congress resisted a formal law, the administration began using secret executive memos to authorize the listening, effectively creating a shadow surveillance state while the public's eyes were fixed on the horizon. The Smith Act, officially the Alien Registration Act of 1940, was a legal hammer designed to crush subversive ideologies by criminalizing the advocacy of a violent government overthrow. Unlike laws targeting specific actions, the Smith Act penalized mere membership in radical groups and the distribution of their literature. By 1941, it became a tool for the thought police. It was weaponized to police the boundaries of American belief. So in a Minneapolis courtroom, 29 members of the Socialist Workers' Party and the Teamsters Union found themselves in the government's crosshairs. They weren't being tried for sabotage or any action, but for their political ideas. They were being tried for the books they read and the speeches they gave. It was a prosecution of intent, a real-world thought crime trial that challenged the very core of habeas corpus and the First Amendment. In December, the jury found 18 of the defendants guilty, and they were sentenced to a year in prison. It was a jarring contradiction and ironic timing. At the exact moment the nation mobilized to defend global freedom, it was demonstrating just how easily civil liberties could be sacrificed at the altar of national security. While the headlines were screaming about a war for freedom against Japanese and Nazi aggression, Americans were being marched toward prison cells for their beliefs. The Ministry of Truth was no longer just a draft in Orwell's notebook. It was an emerging reality on the American home front. But anyway, inventions and technology marched forward. A team led by chemist Glenn T. Seaborg at the University of California, Berkeley, successfully synthesized a new element called plutonium. Though its initial discovery was classified for its potential military application, it was a profound chemical achievement that would have monumental implications for the future of both nuclear power and weapons. On a more domestic level, the first true Jeep, the Willys MB, was rolled out for U.S. military. Rugged, versatile, and instantly iconic, the Jeep became a symbol of American ingenuity and military mobility. In pop culture, 1941 gifted the world a cinematic masterpiece. Orson Welles' Citizen Kane premiered, instantly changing the grammar of filmmaking with its non-linear narrative, deep-focused cinematography, and innovative use of sound. Though not an immediate box office smash, it is now widely regarded as one of the greatest films ever made. In music, a new form of jazz called Bebop began to emerge in the late-night clubs of New York City, led by pioneers like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie, signaling a shift toward complex, fast-tempo improvisation. While the headlines were dominated by the war and Atlantic Charter in Europe, and the Smith Act being carried out on the home front, Americans found a different kind of hero on the baseball diamond. In the summer, the Yankees' Joe DiMaggio captivated a nervous nation with a 56-game hitting streak. To put that in perspective, he faced 197 different pitchers during that 2-month run, hitting .408 for that period. The streak didn't just sell newspapers, it provided a daily beat of objective truth in a year of propaganda. Meanwhile, in Boston, Ted Williams was chasing a ghost. The .400 batting average over the full season. No one had hit .400 in over a decade. And by finishing the season .406, he remains the last player to ever cross that threshold. As the year drew to an end, it culminated in the devastating event that finally drew the U.S. into the war. You guessed it, the surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. Launched by the Imperial Japanese Navy, the two-wave attack, lasting around 2 hours, severely crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sinking or damaging 20 American naval vessels, destroying over 300 aircraft, and killing over 2,400 Americans. At the time, Hawaii was actually a territory, not becoming the 50th state until 1959. But crucially, the attack on Pearl Harbor was coordinated with near simultaneous Japanese assaults on other U.S. territories and possessions, including the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island, as well as British Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch Indies, Burma, and Thailand, signaling the immediate start of a vast multi-front Pacific War. The following day, President Roosevelt famously declared December 7th, a date which will live in infamy. And the U.S., along with Great Britain, formally declared war on the Empire of Japan the next day. A day after that, China officially declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy. While China had been in a state of undeclared war with Japan since 1937, they had maintained cautious diplomatic ties with Germany and Italy. By issuing this former declaration, China nullified all previous treaties with the Axis powers and officially became one of the primary members of the Allied coalition, later known as the Big Four. Then 2 days later, on December 11, Germany and Italy, honoring their treaty obligations, declared war on the U.S., plunging the nation into a total global conflict. I hope you followed all that, which concludes today's episode. This has been Old News, a year in review. Remember, those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Thanks again for tuning in. Stay curious.